In this lesson you will learn about durational aspects of music, including pulse, tempo, rhythm, and meter. By the end of this lesson you should be able to distinguish among pulse and beat, tempo, meter, and rhythm. You should be able to write note values and rests of any duration, and you should be able to distinguish among dots, ties, and slurs, and use each correctly. There are four main aspects included in discussions of musical time. These include pulse or beat, the two are interchangeable for my purposes, tempo, meter, and rhythm. We'll examine each one in detail. Fundamental to any discussion of time in music is the idea of the pulse or beat. The pulse is a series of equally spaced, undifferentiated time points. If you turn on a metronome, what you'll hear is a beat. It's sometimes useful to think of a pulse as a series of dots equally spaced on a page. No one dot is any more or less important than any other dot, and they repeat at regular intervals. Any note value can serve as the pulse in a piece of music. Most commonly you'll see half notes, quarter notes, or eighth notes serving as the pulse. Rarely you will see 16th notes or whole notes. You should take notice that notes consist of a note head, a stem, and in some cases a flag. Note heads are small slanted ovals. Stems are straight lines that span an octave on the staff. If the stem points up, it goes on the right side of the note head. If the stem points down, it goes on the left side. Typically, if a note is above the middle line of a staff, the stem will point down. If it's below the middle line of the staff, it will point up. Tempo refers to the speed at which the pulses recur. It's generally spoken of in terms of a continuum from slow to fast. I have two sets of dots on the page. We might visualize the first one as a slower tempo. The dots are larger and farther apart. And the second as a faster tempo. The dots are smaller and closer together. Alternatively, we can just move from dot to dot at different speeds on the first line. So a slow tempo might go dot, 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 dot. A faster tempo might go dot, 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 dot. There are two common ways of indicating tempo. The first is to use a series of expressive terms. I've included some common ones here, arranged from slowest to fastest, but there are quite a few others. A good music dictionary would be helpful to have handy in case you come across unfamiliar terms. The second, more contemporary way that tempo is indicated involves the number of beats per minute. This approach stems from the use of a metronome. 50 beats per minute is a very slow tempo. There's less than one beat every second. 120 beats per minute is quite fast. There are 2 beats every second. You should be able to find a chart pretty easily that correlates expressive tempo markings with beats per minute or metronome settings. Meter is the grouping of pulses into regularly recurring patterns of strong and weak. I've added a second row of dots to the pulse diagram. Think of these hierarchically. The top line of dots works almost like an accent. 2 dots indicates strong, and 1 dot indicates weak. This pattern then could be understood as strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak. We call this duple meter because of the strong-weak pair. Triple meter groups the pulses into a pattern of strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak. So strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak. Quadruple meter is also a possibility. In quadruple meter, the third beat is typically a little stronger than the surrounding weak beats, but not quite as strong as the first beat. Because of this, when you're listening to a piece of music, it can be difficult to tell if something is in duple or quadruple meter unless you have the music in front of you. Other meters are possible as well. For instance, we could have a meter that goes strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak. While it appears somewhat irregular, the pattern of accentuation repeats after 5 beats, and thus satisfies our definition of meter. At this point, we won't deal too much with irregular meters like this, but you should be aware that they exist. If we look at a piece of music, we can quickly determine the meter based on information at the left-hand side of the staff. After the clef and the key signature, you'll often find information about the meter. In this case, the melody is Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. The top number, 2, tells us we're in a duple meter. The bottom number tells us that the quarter note is the pulse unit. You can see that the bar lines divide the melody up into pairs of quarter notes, and these pairs all follow the strong-weak pattern characteristic of duple meter. Here's a typical pa-pa waltz accompaniment. The top number of the time signature here is a 3, which tells us we're in triple meter. The pa-pa corresponds neatly with our understanding of triple meter as strong, weak, weak. The bottom number again is 4, which tells us that the quarter note is the beat unit. Taken together, these two numbers are called a time signature or meter signature. Rhythm is the grouping and/or division of pulses. Note that this definition is independent of meter. It is possible to have rhythm without meter. In the example, we can see a pattern of descending quarter notes, which are the unit of pulse in this case, and we would count them as ta, 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 ta. We can divide those pulses in half, resulting in eighth notes. This is just simple fractions. Half of a quarter is an eighth. We would count this passage as ta-dee, 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 ta-dee. The syllable ta marks the pulse, and the syllable d indicates the division of that pulse. We can also group beats together. The first measure here is the same as the first measure on the last slide. In the second measure, I've made each pitch twice as long. In order to show this, I've tied two notes together. So if I perform the first one, it goes ta, 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 ta. If I perform the second one, it goes ta, 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 ta. A tie adds the durations of two or more notes together. It works basically like an addition sign. While they may look the same, ties and slurs are two different things. Ties must connect two or more of the exact same pitches, and notes under the tie are not rearticulated. It ends up sounding like one long note. Slurs connect different pitches. They're often used to indicate breathing or phrasing. It is possible, however, to have slurs and ties in the same group of notes. In this example, the D's will be held for 2 beats and will be grouped with the 2 notes under the slurs. So if I perform this, I would count 1, 2. Do, mi, do, la, sol, mi, re, do. In this example, I've rewritten the tied quarter notes as half notes. Both of these passages would be performed in exactly the same way. Ta, 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 ta. Augmentation dots are another way of grouping notes together. An augmentation dot adds half of the value of the note to itself. A dotted half note would be held for a half note plus a quarter note. A dotted quarter would be held for a quarter note plus an eighth note, and a dotted eighth would be held for an eighth plus a 16th. Here's a melody that features dotted notes. It sounds like this. 1, 2. Sol, do, mi, re, do, ti, la, sol, la, ti, do. The dotted half note is held for a half plus a quarter, so it fills the measure in 3/4 time. The dotted quarter is a beat and a half long. If we add it to the eighth note and the quarter note in that measure, we get 3 beats total. This diagram, which I suspect many of you have seen before, shows the relationships among notes of different durations. If you can do basic addition and division with fractions, this should be easy for you. 2 halves make a whole, half of an eighth is a 16th, and so on. Every note value also has a corresponding rest. This chart, which is set up very much like the previous one, shows what these rests look like. Just like notes, rests can be dotted. They are never tied or slurred. If you look at the bottom 2 lines of this diagram, you'll notice that the eighths and sixteenths on the left side have flags, while the ones on the right side have beams. Either is correct, but sometimes composers will choose one over the other in certain circumstances. Rests are never beamed. This is an excerpt from Handel's Messiah. You'll notice that he uses flags for the notes in the soprano solo and beams for the piano part. He chose flags for the vocal part because they correspond with the syllabification of the text. Each syllable gets its own individual note. He chose beams in the piano part because they clarify the meter and the divisions of the beat for the piano. They make it easier for the piano player to read. We'll talk more about beaming and stemming in the next lesson. So now you should be able to distinguish among pulse and beat, tempo, meter, and rhythm. You should be able to write note values and rests of any duration, and you should be able to distinguish among dots, ties, and slurs, and to use each correctly. Once you're finished, post any discussions that you might have to the discussion board, and feel free to help out your classmates by answering their questions as well. To have a little bit of fun, I've actually posted in the discussion board for this unit one of my favorite examples of irregular meter, and I've talked a little bit about how the meter is grouped and organized in this particular piece. I would encourage you to do the same if you have favorite examples or want to comment on my example. Also, make sure you do the quiz on Canvas. As always, you can take it as many times as you'd like, and you can use whatever materials you have handy, but you must score 100% before coming to class, and you must also be able to score 100% before going on to the next module.